Thank you so much, Joseph, for dumping me in this situation. Thank you, everybody, and I'll try not to take up too much of your time because I realize we're at the end of the day. I took it upon myself to bring just one copy of the technical standards that we've recently produced in the UK, thinking that they might be interesting to discuss with people. And there's clearly a bit of interest in them from people since we laid them out on the table this morning. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about how they came to be, what they're designed to do, and then I'm available for the rest of the conference if anybody wants to speak to me. So I'll try not to take up too much of your time. And now you've given me a microphone, I would just like to say congratulations to all of you that have been involved in producing the standards, because I think that you've done a fantastic job. And in the UK, we don't have anything quite that matches this, and we'll certainly be promoting it to the arborists in the UK. So going back to technical standards, my background is as a contractor and then as a trainer, and for the last 20 years or so I've been involved in developing standards, and I've been working for the Arboricultural Association for the last 15 years as a technical officer. I was involved in the development of the first tree climbing guidebook that we produced in the UK, which was in 1998, called A Guide to Good Climbing Practice. And that set out the principles of climbing that were appropriate then. In 2003-04, as many of you will be aware, the EU introduced an EU directive for work at height, and that was a generic piece of legislation for the whole of the European community to take on board. And the UK did that, and we introduced our work at height regulations in 2005. And that required us in the arboricultural community to revisit our guidance, and we produced a new Guide to Good Climbing Practice in 2005 that reflected most of those regulations. And that guidance stood for many years and was generally recognized in the UK as the standard that people should adhere to. In around 2010, we recognized that it was time to review that guide. And in 2010, I thought I was starting a relatively simple review process. But it turned into a much bigger piece of work than that. And the first thing that we decided we needed to do, rather than just revise the guidance, is we needed to take a wider look at the whole principles of managing tree work at height. And that involved producing a document which we called the Industry Code of Practice for arboriculture, for managing tree work at height. And that is the larger format document that I'll leave out for people to look at. So this document is really aimed at what we call the responsible person, i.e. the manager of an arboricultural company, the person who makes the decisions about planning, about roles and responsibilities, and the sort of strategic principles of managing work at height. And that was necessary as a starting point before we did the revision of the actual technical guidance. Meanwhile, a couple of years before that, a colleague in the UK and somebody you'll know, Andy Detter, of Brudian Partners, who's based in Germany, worked on a standard for rigging, not a standard, a research document into rigging in arboriculture. And that was produced in 2008 and was a very detailed piece of work on the forces applied when carrying out different aspects of rigging. So our plan was always to incorporate that work into the technical guides that we then produced. And to try and keep it short, we worked on producing 5 technical guides, one on basic tree climbing, one on using tools within the tree, so chainsaw use and handsaw use and so on, one on rigging, and then one on use of mobile elevated work platforms in tree work, and one on use of mobile cranes in tree work. So there are 5 different titles, and we now have 5 different technical guides. One other little detail that I'll just talk about, because I think it's relevant to you, is that the process, we'd almost completed the basic tree climbing technical guide, and we're about ready to publish when our health and safety regulatory body, called the Health and Safety at Work, the Health and Safety Executive, or HSE, they looked at a draft of our guidance and they said, you are not describing the work at height regulations, which is the same legal requirements that we are all required to work to. They accused us of not writing that down accurately, because all arborists used to climb on a single line, albeit a doubled line if we were using moving rope technique or stationary rope technique. Either way, it was a single line. And the work at height regulations really specifically say that anybody working at height must have a primary system and must always also have a backup system. And that really threw us into a long period of argument and discussion with the HSE, because there was a huge resistance to change. And about 2 years later, we accepted that, in principle, what they were saying was true. But we went through a very hard period in that time, and one of the things that persuaded us that we had to comply with their request was we spoke to the Industrial Rope Access Organisation in the UK, and various other people working at height talked to us, and they all said, well, of course you've got to have 2 lines. You know, how have you been managing all these years on only 1 line? So it was a big shock for us, and basically we've now written our tree climbing guidance, which says you must have a backup when you're climbing at all time. And there can be all sorts of different ways of achieving that. It doesn't necessarily have to be 2 entirely separate rope systems. It could be a single rope system plus an adjustable lanyard, for example, or if you're working on a stem on spikes, it can be a lanyard and a single line. But one way or another, you must always have 2 systems. So that's a big piece of news in the UK, and we're slowly adapting to it. And I'll be very interested to chat to any of you that want to talk about what the effects of that will be in Europe, and how you feel that your country will take that on. I won't speak about each individual one. The use of cranes in tree work is also quite a novelty for us. We've learnt, as I'm sure you have, some of the pitfalls of using with cranes, and to our cost. And we now have a standard that is accepted by our health and safety regulator for using cranes in tree work, which is a good step forward. So I'll stop there, because I realise I'm overstaying my welcome otherwise. But I'm very happy to chat to any of you about the work. And if you want to access these guides, they're available on our website, which is www.trees.org.uk. And I think that's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much.
We thank you.